So here we are at the end of another month. That means Q&A time. Many thanks as ever to everyone who submitted a question, and apologies in advance to all those I didn't get around to answering. By the way, if you'd like to post a question in the future, do keep an eye out on the community tab. I post regular calls for questions over there. So on that note, let's get started. The first question comes from Schreiger. Is there any chance, or at least any talk about the ways to rework discussions over the change of borders in a more functional shape? So I know you phrased this in a much broader terms, and I remember you also sort of said that you didn't quite know exactly how to sort of reconcile all the different elements that you wanted to bring together. But, I think this is a really, really interesting and important question because, of course, this is something that now is coming much more to the fore of international relations. Of course, we have the war in Ukraine and the Russian invasion. And what we're seeing at the moment is more and more talk from the Trump administration that any peace deal in Ukraine would have to accept some sort of change of borders. Now, for anyone who knows and has watched the channel on a regular basis, they'll know that this is something that I am really, really worried about and I stand against. That's not to say that I oppose the change of borders. I oppose unilateral changes of borders. I oppose changes of borders that are brought about by armed force. We have created a system over the past 80 years where that old model, that realpolitik model of might makes right, where one country could march into the territory of another country and just seize it by armed force, had been set aside. And that has given us a remarkably long period of peace in international relations. Now, there are also obviously lots of other factors that sort of come into it. You can talk about the balance of power from the Cold War era, for example. But essentially, and of course, people will also point out but there were that and the other wars. Yes, there were wars. But if you consider that we've got how many countries in the world, so it's 193 UN members, that the number of territorial wars between them have actually been remarkably low over the past 80 years, all things considered. And especially, the example I always give is look at Africa. You have a lot of borders there which were drawn up by colonial powers. Those borders have largely held. There have been remarkably few wars of territorial aggrandizement or, seizing of territory in Africa. And I think that what we're seeing at the moment is a real danger that we could be moving into a different era. But I think also, there seems to be underpinning this question an element of pragmatism. Is there something that can be done to recognise that there will be borders in the international system which people are unhappy with? And I think, we then run into a very, very real and interesting debate. And this is something, I've actually given a lot of thought to from a slightly different perspective, not from the perspective of one country wanting territory from a neighbour, but more from the perspective of what do you do in sovereign states when you have peoples within it who are unhappy being part of that state and want to break away. Now, they might want to break away to form an independent state, or they might want to break away to join another state. And this is something that actually a lot of people who work in the field of international relations secession have been thinking about for a very long time. And it's one of these sort of things where that there are lots of imperfections in the current system, but it's very difficult to see how that can be fixed. We essentially accept the sovereignty of nation states, that they have a right to have their borders respected by the international community, and that also means that unilateral secession, so groups wanting to break away, that won't be recognised by the international community. And as I always have to say in these situations, yes, I know about Kosovo. I've written extensively on Kosovo. I said why this was a very problematic case for precisely these reasons. So before anyone jumps in and says, what about Kosovo? Yes, Google my name and Kosovo, and you will see lots and lots that I've written on this. So essentially, though, on this principle, I think I can see where you're coming from, but it becomes very difficult to open up. How would you frame that debate? How do you change those rules. And in many ways, what happens is that you actually just return back to the current system where you say, look, for as imperfect as it is, and the problems that it might raise, it is still far better than trying to introduce new rules which might upend that system, because then you've got to somehow get all those countries to agree on what those new rules will be. Otherwise, it just becomes a sort of effectively a unilateral decision, or it just becomes a group of states which says, well, we are going to follow this rule in future. And that will create all sorts of more uncertainty in the system. So I think, again, so I can see really where you're coming from on this one, but it becomes very, very difficult to see how we would do this in a way that bypasses the current setup, which essentially comes down to it would be the UN Security Council which would make a decision. If they can all agree, then we get into a situation where borders can be changed, and we can point to several of those cases where that's happened. I think the most obvious one, and in fact, and I mention it many times, the only truly successful example of a secession, a unilateral secession, which was later accepted by the international community, was Bangladesh in the early 1970s. It's fleetingly rare that we do see a change of these borders, and I know that it leads to all sorts of frustration and things, but it's very, very difficult, as I say, to construct an alternative model to this. So there were a number of questions on the European Union, the first of which came from Yaquin Memoli, who asked, is it even possible for Canada to join the European Union? So this was actually one of a number of questions that I was asked about the European Union, and this is a really, really interesting question because, of course, this has become a hot topic that we've seen over the past couple of months. And as I'm recording this, in actual fact, the news has just broken that Mark Carney and the Liberal Party have won a victory in Canada. And in many ways, it's sort of pushing back from this idea that's been pushed by Donald Trump that, he wants to make Canada the 51st state, something which I think many of us felt was a bit of a joke, but in actual fact is now being taken sort of, it seems that he is a lot more serious than I think many of us thought he was. So the short answer to this is no, Canada can't join the European Union. The reason we can sort of say quite clearly is because actually this is written in the Treaty on the European Union, the main treaty which governs the European Union, which actually states categorically that membership is only open to European states. The question is, what exactly constitutes a European state? And this actually isn't quite as clear. So we know that only European states can join, but what is a European state? Well, that's left open. It's not terribly well known, but in actual fact, Morocco applied to join the European Union back in the 1980s, and it was rejected on the basis that it wasn't a European state. So we can say that we know that it was argued that because it was part of Africa that it couldn't join Europe. But then you get into the question of what then constitutes Europe, because of course there are a number of other countries that have lined up. So we know that there's the debate on Turkish membership, and I'm going to tackle that in another question. We know that there's also questions about the Caucasus. So Georgia has applied to join, and there's also questions about Armenia. Again, I'll tackle that in another question in just a minute. But I think it's really, really interesting to see that what we can say is that there are all sorts of ways that Canada, even if it can't join the European Union, can become far more closely involved in the European Union. And I think sometimes we sort of think of European Union membership in very binary terms. You're either a member or you're not. And of course, it's much, much more complicated than that. So countries, yes, of course, you can say countries are either, they've either joined the European Union or they haven't. But there's all sorts of different, if you like, concentric rings to that membership that extend out, that mean that some countries can be part of one aspect of EU membership and not a part of another. And equally, external countries can also be part of the European Union in some sort of way, or tied in more accurately, I think we can say, with EU programs. And that offers a whole range of possibilities for Canada to work with the European Union, which I think are certainly worth exploring. So one of the big ones that they're talking about at the moment is obviously defence and security. This is becoming a really huge issue with the question about the future of NATO, what the United States is going to be doing. And there is so much more talk now about Europe needing to take its security into its own hands. And I think there is an interesting debate to be had about whether Canada could be part of that. It's obviously a NATO member, a long-standing NATO member, and maybe this is an option that it could look into. At the moment, the key focus of this is obviously on the United Kingdom. Since Brexit, relations between United Kingdom and Europe haven't been terribly good. There's lots and lots of talk of resetting it and trying to manage it, and it seems that defence and security is the key area. And it actually makes a lot of sense for it to be the key area for focus on trying to rebuild that relationship. So this might be an area, for example, that Canada could get involved in. And then you've got a whole range of other EU programs. So, for example, you can talk about Horizon, which is the EU's research program that you can see how other countries are becoming involved in that. There's a whole range of different areas where it might be possible to reach agreements that would actually strengthen that relationship between Canada and the European Union, even if it can't actually become a full member. So Marco Colo, a long-standing channel member, asks, I recently read that the Armenian parliament has passed a bill committing the government to start EU accession talks as soon as possible. Do you think it's realistically possible that Armenia will ever join the European Union? So, Marco, thanks so much for a really great question. This is something that I've given a lot of thought to. As you know, I've spent a lot of time in Armenia. I've been many times. It's a country that I find fascinating. But I have always thought, whenever I've been there, that it seems far less inclined towards Europe than, for example, neighbouring Georgia, which obviously now is a candidate, although that has effectively been sunk by political developments in Georgia. But it always struck me as really interesting, why didn't Armenia have a more pro-European outlook before now? And it's not a straightforward answer. I think it was a combination of different things. I think in large part it was because it had a much closer relationship with Russia. It felt very insecure in its position. I mean, you speak to Armenians and they feel themselves as sort of, they will often say, well, look, we're trapped between Turkey and Azerbaijan, these two countries which are hostile towards us. We need to have an ally where we can. Russia seems to be the best ally for that. And there are actually Russian military bases still in Armenia. But I think that has changed a lot in the past 5 years. Many Armenians felt profoundly let down by the fact that Russia didn't step in and help them on Nagorno-Karabakh when Azerbaijan retook that territory. And I think that has opened up a real debate about the future. You have a prime minister who I think is much more inclined to look towards the West and to Europe in Nikol Pashinyan. But I also think that, what always struck me as really interesting is that many Armenians would come across as being profoundly, uncertain that Armenia actually had a European identity, which I always found sort of really, really strange, because to my mind, yes, very clearly it did on all sorts of levels. Armenian is an Indo-European language. Not that it, I've ever believed that this is a fundamental requirement of EU membership. And, I think we can see that there are countries in the Southeast Europe which are clearly European and moving towards EU membership. But, Armenia is also a Christian country, that it has a very large diaspora community across Europe. There are all sorts of obvious ties there that would link it with Europe. But you got the sense that they would almost be asking themselves, why would Europe want us? What's in it for them? Without necessarily realising, in many ways, Europe doesn't tend to work in that way. It sort of rather says, look, you are a European state, you have a right to join. So I think that this is a really, really interesting development that the Armenian parliament has passed this bill, and it's now entered into law. It's been signed by the president, that actually requires the country to sort of move towards EU accession. I think it's a wonderfully positive development. I mean, it's not going to mean that Armenia is going to join tomorrow. Anyone who follows EU accession will know that this is a very long, complex procedure. But I think that this is a very, very positive step forward, and I think it's a positive step forward in a number of ways. I think it'll hopefully be good for the country. It would allow sort of more modernisation and development. Although I have to say that every time I go, I do find, you're seeing so much rapid improvement in so many ways in that regard. So as I say, I think this is a really, really good development, and I do actually think it is realistically possible for Armenia to join the European Union. That said, I do think that what we're seeing in Georgia is complicating matters, because if you look at a geographical map of Europe, if you were to see, all right, so we've got the question of Turkey, and I'm just going to park that for a moment because that'll be the question I'm going to tackle next. You could conceivably say, well, look, you've got the Black Sea between sort of Romania, Bulgaria and Georgia, and then that creates the link with Armenia. But if Georgia's membership is now effectively on hold, and we don't know when that's going to be restarted, it's all going to come down to internal developments there, then Armenia starts to look quite a long way away from Europe. And I think that there will be those who will probably be more nervous about taking in a country which is so separate geographically that there aren't any sort of links onto it. So that's to say that I think that Armenia is very much a European country. I think, it's good that it's trying to take it forward, but in many ways I can also see that the logic behind it also ties in with Georgian membership, that I think if we were talking about those two together, then I think it would make an even stronger case. And that, again, is not to say that this isn't a strong case, that it's something that can't be pursued without Georgia. But I think a lot of European decision makers looking at the map will be sort of thinking that it becomes a little bit more difficult to envisage. Not impossible by any stretch, but I'm just sort of thinking very much on the psychology of this. Baruch Gorechi asks, what do you think about Turkey's future? Will Turkey be a Middle Eastern country, or will it join Europe? So look, this is a bit of a theme on this Q&A that has been, a couple of questions on, whether Canada could join the European Union, whether Armenia could join the European Union. And of course, we've then got Turkey. And Turkey, of course, is a long-standing, not only candidate for EU membership, but it's actually formally begun accession negotiations, although those have been now on hold for the best part of a decade. And this really is the key question that I think many of us who follow Turkey for a very long time are asking ourselves. So we had a process to see Turkey join the European Union. And I remember looking back about 20 years ago, when the Justice and Development Party, the AKP, first won the elections in November 2002 in Turkey. And then in 2003, Recep Tayyip Erdogan became the Turkish Prime Minister. And now, obviously, he's president. There was a great deal of hope that Turkey could press forward with its EU membership aspirations. It was formally given the green light in 2005, and it opened up those negotiations. And as I say, there was a sense that things were moving forward, but I think that there's been a couple of factors which have really worked against that. I think part of it has clearly to be is linked with what's happened in Turkey, that this is a country where, to use the usual terminology, we've seen democratic backsliding quite clearly under Recep Tayyip Erdogan, that what we have seen happen is that there has been, very, very serious steps away from sort of democratic norms and standards that one would expect to see from an EU member state. At the same time, and I think we also have to be very honest as well, that there has always been a degree of prejudice within the European Union about taking in Turkey. that has made it very, very difficult to see how that would happen. And I have to say, and I've said it before, I've never bought into this, what we could call the existential argument. Is Turkey a European country? That's never, as somebody who works on Southeast Europe, who's somebody who's sort of looked at the region in spent most of my career working on it, I've never really felt that in itself is a question. There are questions about democracy. There are questions about certain foreign policy issues, not least of all Cyprus, which, as many regular viewers will know, is another issue that, I follow very closely. These matter, but the idea that you could say that, you get to the border between Turkey and Bulgaria or Turkey and Greece and suddenly Europe stops and that's it, doesn't make a lot of sense. Turkey has for hundreds of years been part of Europe. And even the religious argument, we are talking about other Southeast European Muslim states which have been shaped by the Ottoman Empire, by the predecessor of Turkey. We don't question their European credentials. We don't do that with Bosnia. We don't do it with Albania. Looking at some point in the future into, potentially Kosovo. So I think it's we need to be very, very careful about that. But I think that there are very real problems now about the way that Turkey is developing. But again, I come back to the point that I made on Canada, is that, and especially after Brexit, I think that we can envisage different ways that Europe works with its neighbours, or the European Union works with its neighbours, that would allow a lot of flexibility. And one of the key issues that really is clearly on the agenda now, again, is security and defence. And Turkey is a significant actor when it comes to this. And I know that there's a lot of concern about the way that Turkey has behaved in recent decades, and it's concerns that I fundamentally share, that I don't believe that it's been the best of allies, that I think that, on many issues, I think Europe would and could and should have expected a much greater degree of cooperation from Turkey, for example, on Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But what I think we're seeing at the moment is Turkey, for all sorts of internal and external reasons, trying to rebuild that relationship with Europe. So I don't think we're going to get to a stage where, certainly under Erdogan, we're going to see a resumption of EU accession talks. But I think that we could actually be moving to a stage where Europe says, look, for better or for worse, Turkey is an important country. We need to have a working relationship with it on defence and security. And, that old saying, it's better to have Turkey as part of the club rather than outside, for all the flaws, all the difficulties that can come with it, that I think it is an important country and can play a part. So you talked about it being a Middle Eastern country. It has its ties with the Middle East. We see at the moment that, how, it's a major actor in Syria, that it's extending its influence there. But I still think that, we can think of it as a bridging country. And I still think that it does have a relationship with Europe. It remains on the books, even if just nominally, a potential member of the European Union. I think it's important to have a stable Turkey. I think it's important to have a democratic Turkey. And I think whatever can be done to encourage that and encourage it to still think of itself as a European country, even if that doesn't necessarily mean European Union membership, I think can only be for the positive. Again, recognising that there are a lot of issues that would need to be dealt with. So I think my sense is that whether or not it's we would necessarily see it as European at the moment, I can see a very strong argument for why we would want to encourage it to see itself as a European country. Transagigs asks, given the rising tensions between India and Pakistan and the lack of condemnation of the Russian invasion of Ukraine from members in the global south, how relevant is the Commonwealth of Nations? So this is a really interesting question on all sorts of levels. The Commonwealth, I think most viewers will know that, this is essentially the organisation which gathers together former British colonies, although it has taken in countries that aren't former British colonies. So, for example, Rwanda and Mozambique have joined, and there are talks from other African countries. So, look, on the one hand, you could say, look, this comes across as an insignificant organisation. It's a large member with over 50 countries that are part of it. That this then is a really, it doesn't do much. It's very divided. It's disparate countries with not a lot in common. Several of them have very, very serious disputes between them. You raised a very good point about India and Pakistan, for example. And, as I'm recording this, that, there have been renewed tensions, for example, between the two countries over Kashmir. But I do think the Commonwealth actually does play a role in several ways. So there's the lesser known side of it, where it actually does quite a lot of development work, and it provides a really good forum for a lot of these countries to talk about day-to-day issues and cooperate with each other. Then you've got the more public element, which, again, it provides a forum for these countries and different countries of the global south to engage with one another and with the UK, which, obviously its place in the world has changed, if we're to put it mildly. But it's still a permanent member of the UN Security Council. And so I think that this actually is a really useful way for these countries to talk to each other. And, if it didn't have any value, then we wouldn't see countries wanting to join. So I think it does have a value. I think it would be better if there was more coordination amongst its members on issues. That, you raised a really interesting point about Russia and Ukraine, and that, I think, like many others, I've been disappointed by the way that the Global South has responded to this, and many would say, but it's not their issue. This is a European issue. Why should they care? They should care because it touches on a fundamental principle of international relations, which actually serves especially Africa extremely well, which is that you don't change borders by force, and I've already talked about that in another question, why that's important. So I think, in that sense, it's a shame that the Commonwealth hasn't been a little bit more at the forefront of issues. And again, you mentioned about sort of India and Pakistan, whether this is a forum for them to be able to talk with each other. It's made difficult by the fact that traditionally India has been really opposed to any external intervention on the question of Kashmir. They want to deal with it at a bilateral level. For example, they've surprisingly, even though it was one of the first issues to come on the agenda of the UN Security Council, it's not been debated by the UN since 1965, which is absolutely incredible. We are now talking 60 years since the UN has had a proper debate on Kashmir. But whether something like the Commonwealth might provide a chance, even if it's not to address the underlying issues, at least to de-escalate tensions and allow the countries to have, sort of greater cooperation in that area, that might be something that, for example, it could be looked at. So I think it is actually more relevant than it seems, but not as relevant as it could be. Seth Greenberg asks, do you believe that the nation state will be as relevant in 100 years as it has been for the past 100? If not, how do you believe large populations will organise and sort themselves in the future? Seth, thank you for a brilliant question, because I think this is like, for many IR observers, this is the really, this is a fascinating question. Is there an alternative model to the nation state? And usually what I do is, this would be the point when I would say, well, it's very difficult to see how. I mean, you can look back into the past and you could say that, yes, 1,000 years ago, we had a very, very different international system, that states weren't the fundamental unit, that you had all collection of different things with different sort of allegiances and vassals and kingdoms and duchies and, occasional republics and empires and all this sort of thing. And these have sort of now coalesced into these 193 UN members. And so we now think very much that the nation state is at the centre of international relations, and how can things change? And I think, as I say, at one point I say, well, it'd almost be like trying to imagine a new colour, until I read just these past 2 weeks ago, for anyone who sort of follows science, that apparently there is a colour that we don't see, but can actually people have seen, but it requires sort of something to do with lasers. So that, I know it sounds like a completely weird digression, but it's actually to make the point that I suppose it is conceivable. And I think the one that I would really sort of look to is the European Union, because this falls into a very strange place in international relations. It's not an international organisation, contrary to what some might think. And especially those who don't live within the European Union or don't actually know it terribly well. It's not an international organisation. It's far, far more than that. But neither is it a state or a super state in the making. I've always, sort of felt that the best way of describing it is, a political community. And it retains the functions. Each member state retains its sovereignty, and they pull that sovereignty together. So it has elements that sort of seem to replicate statehood, but in other ways, it's quite clearly not a state. So I think that the EU is a really, really interesting model to follow. And I mean, we can see how that is being followed in other parts of the world. So, for example, in Africa, in Southeast Asia, ASEAN is developing elements which are sort of very similar to the European Union. The African Union has sort of stated its idea that it would really like to move more in the direction of the European Union. I mean, it's a huge task to do that, but I think that this is a really interesting direction. Whether we could see the emergence of new imperial powers, 100 years from now, it's, if you look back 100 years where we were, and where we are today, I guess what I would say is that it's very tempting to think that we've reached a particular stage and it's difficult to see beyond that. But of course, things do change, and do change quite radically. So I think we could see something different, but I really wouldn't know what it is. My best guess, as I say, would be the emergence of these political communities. But of course, a lot of people would say, well, what starts out as political communities will become more and more deeply entrenched politically, and that will become either superstates or empires at some point in the future. So maybe we are caught up in this paradigm of the nation state in one way or another. But I think, as I say, it's a really, really great question, and certainly one to give a lot of thought to. So there were a few questions that talk about humanitarian intervention and changing norms in international relations. So, for example, World Traveller Cooking asked, are we moving back to a place where ethnic cleansing and genocide are accepted, given what's happening in Gaza and Trump's comments on it? And Luke John asks, are humanitarian disasters brought about by military conflict, such as in Sudan, sometimes just too hard to fix? And finally, TK621 asks, why do you think nations have not used responsibility to protect to intervene in conflicts to prevent war crimes and mass atrocities? And can anything be done to improve responsibility to protect so genocides can be prevented? So look, I've grouped these together into one particular response because I think these are all really, really good questions, but all tackle, I think, a central theme, which is really interesting, is that if you look around, there are so many places where terrible things are happening in the world, and yet remarkably little is being done. And I think that this, in many ways, is a reflection of the way that international relations has fundamentally changed over the past 35 years. So, I'm always reminded, I grew up at the tail end of the Cold War, but I started university when the Cold War had just come to an end, and we were talking about a very, very different international system. There was a sense that a lot of the stasis that had been caused by the superpower conflict, which meant that, you couldn't go in and solve a lot of the problems around the world, that had been swept away, and that we could now deal with conflicts and atrocities and genocide. And we saw this in the 1990s. There was a real sense that something was changing, that UN peacekeepers could go in, that you had an era of humanitarian intervention. And this gave rise to this notion of responsibility to protect. But it hasn't delivered on what many of its supporters thought it would. And I think for all sorts of good and bad reasons. I think that we saw that went too far, that while you could argue that there were examples of intervention which were carried out for the best of reasons, humanitarian intervention, it also then sort of extended into almost like a, hubris on the part of the United States, and that culminated in the war in Iraq. That sense of we can just march in and do what we want, borders don't matter, principles of sovereignty don't matter. I think Afghanistan has also played a part in this because, of course, after 9/11, the United States, NATO went into Afghanistan and effectively stayed there 20 years and then was forced to withdraw in absolute chaos, leaving Afghanistan to collapse back into the hands of the Taliban, and any of the progress that had made has now just been completely sort of reversed. So I think that there is now a real sense of caution about the idea of humanitarian intervention. The countries which are best placed to do it no longer want to get involved with it. They see this as just too risky, too costly, that, we can see examples where you just need to look. So, for example, Sudan, the war in Sudan is a huge humanitarian crisis, and very, very little is being done about it. That, this isn't getting the attention, that, countries aren't saying, right, okay, let's assemble a big force to go in there and try and end this. And no, we're just not having those debates anymore. And I think that this is a really, really interesting and disappointing in many ways direction the world has taken. But you can also understand that I think also what we're now seeing is that, with this multipolar world that we're living in, and there is also a concern that we are perhaps returning to that Cold War dynamic, that you can't intervene in one situation because the other side will then sign up with, if one side takes a pro-American point of view, another one maybe a pro-Russian point of view. Of course, all that now is being sort of questioned by what we're seeing happening, at the moment under Trump and his desire to rebuild relations with Russia. But it certainly has made it much more complicated. So I think what we're seeing is that any number of these cases where we would hope that there would have been a much stronger international reaction to it, that's just not happening in the same way that, maybe we could have conceivably seen sort of 15, 20 years ago. So without that external intervention, so to come back to the point that Luke had made about, is it too hard to fix? You really, in many cases, you need to be on the ground, or you have a commitment to be on the ground. And I just don't think there's that willingness. And if there is a willingness, it's very focused on places like Ukraine. And remembering, of course, we've also seen a lot of, reductions in defense spending. I mean, it's going up again, but, you still need to have boots on the ground in these situations. And a lot of countries are sort of saying, well, if we're going to do that, we prefer to be sending our troops to Ukraine than to Sudan, for example. Trying to get other countries to step in, much more difficult. How do you pay for all of this as well? So it's a whole range of problems that I think that have just come together to mean that we're not talking about international intervention in the same way that, as I say, we were 20 years ago. The era has passed. It might come back again, but I think from current situations, it's more a case of, isn't this tragic? Isn't this awful? What is to be done? But there's not a lot of action that's been taken on it. Guy Desnoyers asks, there are several major players in the European Union, and they've not always gotten along. I think it's safe to say that the balance of power has been a priority for many. How could rearmament be achieved without old anxieties resurfacing? So, Guy, thank you very much for that. I had to, and you saw in the comments, I made reference to this. This was an extremely diplomatic way of asking, how do we deal with European nervousness about a rearmed Germany? Essentially, that's what it comes down to. And, this is something that I think is really interesting because it's interesting the question is still asked in many ways, because obviously this harks back to previous era and the sense that Germany is this sort of great power in Europe. If you rearm it, if it sort of takes to the fore in international, in Europe, then it will dominate. And it's so interesting that this retains, even 80 years after the end of the Second World War, this is still something that will be playing on certain people's minds. I would like to think that we have moved beyond that, that in actual fact, now what we're talking about, and you hear this the whole time, is that Europe talks more about European collective defence. It's not just, for example, yes, certain individual countries, especially those close to Russia, will also frame this debate very much in terms of their own national security. But it's interesting to hear how much is now being spoken of countries that aren't on the front line with Russia saying we have got to help Ukraine because this is about protecting European security, and bringing that debate forwards. So I think that this is a really, really interesting question. And of course, it ties in with the fact that, how do you create that European security? Are we still talking about national armies, or are we talking about some sort of rearrangement that you create a European army where different countries then sort of contribute to that in different ways? So I think it ties in with a much bigger question. So I can see why there is a certain degree of nervousness about, Germany sort of coming to the fore on this. But of course, this again touches on some of the other points I've already raised, that, as Europe is talking more about its own defence and security, and that has to be separate from the United States, there's talk about sort of reintroducing Britain into this debate, and this could be a way that Britain and the European Union sort of patch up a lot of the problems that they've had. And it's, as I've already said, this makes a lot of sense in all sorts of ways. But of course, France is a major defence actor in Europe, probably the most important defence actor in Europe. And I'm not sure I see that changing immediately and shifting over to Germany for all sorts of reasons. Germany could potentially be a very important actor in this regard. But I think even as Europe develops, it will be much more balanced than that. And it isn't a question that, we're going to see a renewed German army, which people are going to get very nervous about. Is this going to start marching across sort of borders in Europe? No, I'd like to think that we're well beyond that. And in actual fact, this sort of rearmament, Europe taking control of its own defence, will actually be for the collective good of Europe. And that there is now a much greater sense that Europe as a coherent whole needs to protect itself against outside forces, and that can be in all sorts of different ways. I mean, it's the immediate threat that many would see of Russia, whether one believes, how significant that is. And, I know there's a lot of people who say, well, no, Trump, not Trump, Putin isn't going to march into the Baltics, or Trump march into Greenland, which of course remains part of Denmark. So there is that sort of sense. I think Europe now conceives its security in broader terms, that it's reached a level of internal unity that I don't think the question of one particular member, Germany, increasing its defence and arms is going to be, not even necessarily is going to be read by any others as a threat to their security. Rather, I think they're going to see this as a good thing, because it'll be a contributor to sort of European defence and security more generally. Lee Wanderer asks, what is your definition of the West? Should the US still be considered part of it? Do Switzerland, Ukraine, Israel, Korea, Taiwan, Japan, or Turkey fit the definition? So thanks for a brilliant question. There's a number of really, really great questions. And I think this one is so interesting, isn't it? Because, we use this term, the West, and I think we're sort of wedded to it. But there are all sorts of questions of what do we really mean by it? I mean, we use it as a shorthand, and I think we all sort of know what it means, but it doesn't necessarily, it's not easy to define it in specific terms, which countries. So, you sort of provide that sort of list. I would say that in one way or another, all of them would fit in to the West. But of course, you raise this really important point about the United States and the direction it's taking. And, it would be one thing if it was sliding more into isolation. We've seen isolationist tendencies in the United States. I think the really big fear at the moment is the way that, in actual fact, it seems to be moving against its partners, and not just saying to those partners, look, you do your own thing. We really don't want to get involved. It's not our business, but, we'll keep our troops on the ground. And yes, if you really run into difficulties, we'll be here to bail you out. But essentially, we'd like to focus on our affairs. It seems to go so much more than that. I mean, again, the threats that we've seen against partners, Western partners, so, United States threats against Canada, against Denmark, the fact that J.D. Vance as vice president has been so condescending to Europe. And it's really quite interesting how disliked he is in Europe. I mean, most Trump isn't held in particularly high regard, I think we can say that much. But I do get a sense there's a real loathing of Vance in many parts of Europe that, and of course we saw with that Signal chat that was, declassified, how he was talking down about Europe. And he actually seems, in a way that I don't think Trump is. I mean, I think Trump is very transactional and sees everything through business, how well or not. But I think he isn't anti-European, whereas I get the sense that Vance does see himself as anti-European. He doesn't hold Europe in high respect, doesn't particularly like Europeans for whatever reason. So it does create a really, really important question as what do we mean now by the West? We use it as a shorthand, but that shorthand is becoming increasingly open to question, that I don't think any of us have answers for. And are we talking about a community of democracies, and that then raises questions about certain members? Are we talking about sort of free and open markets? Again, might raise questions. It's one of these questions that I think really we all need to be thinking about. I don't think I'm at the stage where I'm going to say the West is dead. It's looking very, very shaky if we think of it sort of in broad terms with the United States and the way that it's going at the moment. But we might get to a stage where relations can be rebuilt to some extent or another. But I think what we are definitely seeing is, Anna's touched on the previous question, is sort of, is that Europe is coming together much more. And how will it reach out? So in the absence of US leadership, then what emerges amongst like-minded states, which were previously or continue to be what we would nebulously call the West. And I think that this is going to be a really, really interesting dimension of all of this that we're going to need to be sort of thinking about a lot in the coming period, especially, as I say, if things continue on the trajectory that they are with the United States. So, do you know what? I don't know what we would define as the West going forward. I think we can still use the term for the moment, but it's becoming increasingly difficult to understand exactly what constitutes the West, and whether. I think it'll be very difficult to come up with another term which sort of just we can use as shorthand, but that shorthand doesn't seem to really serve its purpose in the way that it once did. So J.K. Reb asks, will the CANZUK Union come to fruition? So this is, I think, ties in many ways with the previous question, because for anyone who doesn't know, CANZUK is the shorthand of Canada, Australia, New Zealand, UK. So it's those four countries working together. I mean, they've obviously got shared history, essentially sort of British dominions, inhabited mainly, ancestrally by white British settlers who then, took over those lands from the original inhabitants. I think and there is a whole history behind that obviously we need to unpack. But essentially, if we just sort of take it in those terms, and it's something that, some people really, believe is an alternative. I don't think that in some sort of cemented political community, to use that term again, that we saw with the European Union, that it would apply. I think they're just too far away from each other. They share very, very close relations. We know that. We know, for example, that they share intelligence, that, you know that there's a lot of military cooperation that goes on between them, that there is naturally an affinity between these countries that makes it very easy for them to talk to each other and share, to use that term, share values, whatever that might mean. But, I think, we can talk that there is quite clearly a strong affinity there. And you see it sort of in all sorts of unusual ways. So, for example, again, we've just seen Mark Carney become, win the election in Canada, and he's now Canadian Prime Minister. He was head of the Bank of England. He worked in Britain and held a very senior position. So we know that there's that close relationship. The fact is, these four countries all share the same head of state. King Charles is not only, king in the United Kingdom, but also king in Canada, king in New Zealand, king in Australia, at least for the meantime. So these are very, very closely linked with one another. But whether we would be talking about some sort of union which would mirror the European Union, where they start sort of harmonising laws and legislation, I don't think we'll see it in that way. I think it's much more likely that the UK will rebuild its relationship with the European Union. And I think in many ways that's much more advantageous for Canada, New Zealand and Australia. I mean, what was really interesting at the time of Brexit, and I remember this really closely, is that, a lot of Brexiters were saying, we leave the European Union, we're going to have this wonderful relationship with Canada, New Zealand, Australia, that this CANZUK is the way forward, that it's a much more natural union for Britain to have. And yet I remember speaking with Australian friends who were saying that this is actually really disastrous for Australia, because the European Union is a huge market and Australia wanted trading relations with it. And it realised that Britain was its best ally within the European Union. And Britain was, of course, one of the big three members of the European Union, along with Germany and France. For a lot of countries, it was actually far more valuable for Britain to be a member of the European Union than being outside it. And I think in many ways, looking ahead, that can be the same. That I think that instead of focusing on a CANZUK union as the alternative for the United Kingdom, I think it would actually make much more sense. And again, referring to the previous question of what do we mean by the West, that these countries all working alongside European partners makes a lot more sense. And so having Britain in a much closer relationship could also be the important thread that works in Canada, New Zealand, Australia's favour in terms of that relationship with the European Union. So speaking very personally, but I'd like to think there's a certain sort of logic behind it, would say that rather than focus on the idea of a CANZUK union, that it actually sort of makes much more sense for Britain to maintain and cultivate those close ties, for all of them to cultivate those close ties, but also working with the European Union and other like-minded countries, to maintain some of those fundamental values of sort of open free trade, liberal democracy, which I think are so very important. So I would say, as I say, not so much will the CANZUK Union come to fruition, but will Canada, New Zealand, Australia, UK continue to work very closely with each other, and also continue to work with Europe and other key partners. Unfortunately, I think that's all we have time for. In the meantime, here are several more videos from the past month that you may have missed. Thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.